for zero trust, I mean, there are so many different aspects to it, and I don't think there's one thing like you could point to and say that's zero trust, right? But the real key foundation there is identity. You have to have a good strategy on how are you going to identify the people that are authenticating into your applications and accessing your data, because everything else is really kind of built upon that. And identity kind of goes into a lot of different aspects on its own right.
Welcome to the Reimagining Cyber podcast, where we share short and to the point perspectives on the cyber landscape. It's all about engaging yet casual conversations on what organizations are doing to reimagine their cyber programs while ensuring their business objectives are top priority. With my co-host, Stan Wisseman, Head of Security Strategist, I'm Rob Borrego, Chief Security Strategist, and this is Reimagining Cyber. So Stan, who do we have joining us today?
Rob, our guest today is Nick Ward. Nick is the Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. Department of Justice and has focused on cybersecurity for over 20 years. Now, Nick has recently been recognized as the Cybersecurity Leader of the Year in the U.S. federal government in support of securing and educating his remote workforce. Congratulations, Nick, on this recognition. And can you expand on your background for our listeners?
Hey, Stan, thanks for having me today. I actually started out my cyber career back in 1997 when I joined the Marine Corps, and I spent about 8 years in the Marine Corps, way back before we even called cyber. Since then, though, I got out of the Marine Corps, and most of my career I've been really focused on providing services or serving the federal government in a few different capacities. But I've also had some stints where I've worked for companies like ArcSight providing or building security operations centers for federal customers and managing SOCs both in and out of the federal government, places like Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan. Most recently, I was the CISO for a global automotive manufacturing tier one supplier. They made car seats for all the big automotive companies, and now I'm the CISO for DOJ and enjoying my time in the federal government.
We want to first off talk about President Biden's executive order on cyber and the intent of trying to raise the bar as to our cyber capabilities. Some have called the SolarWinds attack and the Colonial Pipeline attacks as the main catalyst that brought this to fruition. Do you agree with that?
I'm not going to presume to be in the minds of whoever authored different portions of the executive order. But it was certainly a major driver for everybody working on that. I think if you read through some of the language, there's probably some influence of the Colonial Pipeline incident as well, and that likely went into the EO. But as you can tell, the EO is pretty focused on how does the federal government defend itself against our foreign adversaries, and so for that reason, I think SolarWinds was probably the major driver behind that.
Nick, if we kind of break down the several different components or areas that the executive order covered, right? There's threat intel sharing, there's modernization, securing cloud and zero trust type of architecture models, securing the software supply chain, which again, when you look at SolarWinds, that was a major indicator there. Improving detection and response. So there's a lot going on, right? Yeah. But if we drill specifically into one of the areas to kind of start the conversation, modernization, and think about it in the regards of, zero trust architecture models. What do you view as kind of the key success factors or key elements to implement a zero trust architecture, especially when you think about, the world that you live in, which is so many different agencies underneath the umbrella of DOJ. It's pretty much monumental task to try to kind of bring it all together. But what's your viewpoint on that model and zero trust in general?
Well, so first of all, I think zero trust sometimes gets a bad name in the cybersecurity world because we often are a bit jaded from the vendor community in terms of somebody trying to bring some new marketing term, and I think it's a mistake for people sitting in seats like mine, where we can use that to help really drive change within our organizations, because it's an easy term that we can use to talk about cybersecurity strategies with our executive leadership. And so that's my first thought on it is we need to capitalize on all the work that industry is doing to really to help us brand cybersecurity in a way that is relatable to our absolutely top executives in our organization. So that's my first thought on it. And then for zero trust, I mean, there are so many different aspects to it, and I don't think there's one thing like you could point to and say that's zero trust, right? But the real key foundation there is identity. You have to have a good strategy on how are you going to identify the people that are authenticating into your applications and accessing your data, because everything else is really kind of built upon that. And identity kind of goes into a lot of different aspects on its own right. Making sure that we know who the people are. You know, you may want to, for your most critical sets, you need to be able to have a more dynamic look at that identity. So you might be okay with lower levels of credentials, like softer credentials that are more username and password based for very unsensitive data sets or even public data sets. But for those really critical things, I think zero trust is the idea that we're looking at the stuff dynamically based on the risk of the data that they're accessing. So I may want to know about the security posture of the device that they're coming from, where they're connecting from, how did we vet the identity of this person. So that's probably one that gets overlooked a lot is, you know, we have a good credential, we're doing MFA in all the right ways, but do you even know that the person actually is who they said they were? Did the agency that you're trusting sponsor them in a way that you have a high level of confidence that they actually are Nick Ward or or whoever else? So identity and access management, I think, is really the key foundation of zero trust, and then you have to start building around that. And for us, that means we're building out we're building out the identity first, making sure that we have a good idea of what that is. We're using commercial services to help us build that. And then I want to micro segment all of our applications. So I'm making those dynamic decisions on a very, I would love to do it down to the database or the actual data level. That's going to be very dependent on the application. But I also think it's important to be successful in this area. We can't let perfection prevent us from making progress in this area. We've got to be looking at what are the foundational capabilities, build that, and start bringing on your applications. If you've got legacy applications, get it brought in. Don't wait 5 or 10 years until you modernize the application. Bring it in now. Isolate the thing, put a proxy in front of it, whatever you got to do to start leveraging the benefits of zero trust architectures today.
The executive order seems to address a lot of issues associated with third parties and supply chain risks. Do you see the steps being taken going to be adequate as far as helping us gain trust in those relationships, either be the third parties that you deal with or the software supply chain that you're dependent on?
Supply chain risk management and doing third party risk assessments, I think it's probably one of the toughest problems that we face. There's thousands and thousands of vendors out there, and I think it's we're fooling ourselves if we think we can manage the security of every vendor that we collaborate with. But so the things that we are doing is, looking at what are our most critical vendors, the ones that can hurt us the most, and making sure, trying to bring up the whole industry, like getting better standards out there, trying to use our ability to, our dollars, like how much money we spend, to help drive change in that regards. We can't buy from certain types of vendors unless you've done, these kinds of certifications and things like that. Trying to raise the bar for the whole industry. As a whole government, as a whole industry, we do have to put pressure on ourselves to be introspective and really raised our cybersecurity bars internally, which will in turn reap benefits across, both from the customer side and from the supplier side.
So Nick, you mentioned standards. One of the requirements out of the executive orders for NIST with others supporting them to define what critical software means, and that should help you prioritize what you need to focus on. They've also rolled out some preliminary guidance that they call fundamental around the kind of measures you need to put in place. How are you going to move forward, given that this is now on the table, as far as identifying critical software, taking action based on the recommendations they've rolled out?
NIST gives us is giving us another tool for us to be able to figure out how to apply supply chain risk management, and it helps us focus on those situations where a foreign nation state may target U.S. trusted, high quality companies, and because they have that trust with us, and it helps us realize and focus and prioritize looking at the same kinds of criteria for those vendors. And then we certainly have to modernize our supply chain risk management programs to how do we evaluate a trusted company, and a lot of that's going to focus on what are the right mitigations. Like, this is a critical vendor. How do we build our security architectures in the context that that trusted vendor could be compromised by an adversary and used to target me? And that's probably the biggest change that we're looking at is supply chain risk management won't be should we use this vendor or not, but how do we integrate them into our architecture in a safe way?
Within the executive order, kind of maybe a little bit buried within it, was the whole concept of SBOMs, right? Software bills of material, which is picking up some good momentum. Now, there's a flip side kind of risk associated to it, which is as we kind of put the recipe out there that says exactly the ingredients associated to the deliverable of that software, the adversary gets their hands on it as well, right? So they really understand exactly what's within there. So there's some concerns kind of on that side of the equation. When you look at the movement and kind of positive progression that SBOMs are starting to pick up on here, what's the take within government? Are you seeing that become much more of a formal, yes, we're going to go forward with this? And is it gaining positive traction in your regard as well?
Just my personal take on it would be looking at things from the perspective of attackers aren't limited by laws. They're not limited on ethics or anything like that. And they're figuring out, which vendors are using which backend libraries. They can find that out in various ways. And by keeping that secret doesn't necessarily protect us, because if I don't know as a customer that a particular library is part of, or a software package or whatever is part of a product that I'm buying, and we find out that it's targeted, some vendors will be good about that and tell me about it, and some probably won't. I'm an advocate of information sharing, and this would be an aspect of that. You could probably come up with ways to do that securely, I suppose, but initially it probably is a risk to do it right out the gate. But over time, vendors will have to adapt to that. They'll have to realize that, and they should already realize that the backend softwares that are being used, you can see like a particular library has, however millions of downloads. So it's probably highly prevalent in commercial software being provided. So it's hard to believe that adversaries are not already targeting those types of packages now. And so what do? I think this is an area where highlighting those things and making sure that that as a community that we're getting more eyes on those kinds of packages that do have high risk. Like who's vetting the software, who's vetting backdoors in those kinds of libraries. There's nobody's responsible for it per se. So I'm an advocate, I suppose, of more information is better.
Hey, Nick, I'd like to transition to another area, one that you know quite well, is around security operations and how we can improve the detection and response to these bad actors. We need to obviously reduce that dwell time and the amount of volume of data we have to go through and the velocity of the data is difficult to cope with. And you've helped build security operations centers to help organizations be successful, more successful in detecting these bad actors. What role do you see machine learning and artificial intelligence playing going forward? I mean, I personally think that we need to sort of fuse the two, the human element, the human intelligence and the machine intelligence to deal with this. But in the government space, is that something that you're seeing happen as well?
For most, I would say 99% of security operations centers out there, they're probably not building their own ML libraries or AI libraries, right? They're depending on industry products that incorporate those capabilities, and so it absolutely is having an impact, right? It's speeding up detection. Hopefully, they're doing that faster than our adversaries are. But most organizations in the federal government or in commercial, they're not likely staffed and resourced to the level where they're bringing on their own AI developers and developing their own analytics. We're depending on the fact that there's lots of customers buying these commercial products, and these vendors hopefully are adopting those types of capabilities.
Nick, I want to go back to one of the things that you were alluding to a bit, and you're an advocate of, as am I, and have been for a long time. It's all about really, again, collaboration and in regards to threat intel sharing, which again is one of the key elements called out within the executive order. You know, we were speaking with Michael Eccles, who you know, on an episode or two ago, and he's a major proponent. He's seen though the barriers kind of between private and public sector in regards to sharing of intel, where there's kind of a feeling at times where, you know, public sector is asking for more than they're willing to share, and private sector on the other way around is kind of doing a bit of the same. So, you know, what's your viewpoint? Are there some kind of key areas that we can break down these barriers and just do a much better job overall at threat intel sharing?
I think there are some clear barriers. I mean, you know, government has a special mission in terms of, like, there's fears of things like, if I share this information with the government, am I going to be prosecuted as a result, or could I get sued? And we have things like FOIA that, if you want to share information with us, can we protect that from being disclosed through a FOIA request? And those are some of the challenges that I think, and I'm not going to speak for industry. They probably have other concerns also. I do. Fortunately, I think there are people thinking about those problems and trying to come up with ways to solve them. It's a hard problem though, and a lot of it has to come down to trust. And can we trust each other to share the information? I think there's a strong desire on both sides to do so. That, I mean, our adversary, like, they're getting better and better, and they're not they're not shy about sharing information. They're selling malware, botnets, access to my systems, and everything else, and they'll share it, sell it, however they can commoditize it, and we need to be doing the same thing.
Hey, Nick, one of the themes that we've had on this podcast is around cyber resilience, and would love to get your view on this, because certainly some of the things we've talked about, like zero trust, can lead to better resilience to be able to withstand attacks. We obviously need to do a lot more to be able to, you know, detect and respond quickly, to be able to continue to operate in the face of these waves of attacks that we're seeing. There's certainly things like security hygiene, the basics that are critical to get done. What are you seeing as a trend as far as in DOJ and other places in the government, as far as building in that resilience? Is the executive order part of that, as far as helping folks raise that bar and enabling them to continue to operate?
Yeah, I mean, so we had started this journey, years ago in reality. I mean, we looked at threat cons and things like that and tried to learn how to apply those to cyber systems. And it's a tough problem. It's trying to figure out, what are you willing to live without when an attack is ongoing. But unfortunately, a lot of those attacks, you don't know about it until it's already impacting you. So that's part of the problem, I think, with some of those kinds of programs. So I I think where you're headed is the right direction. Like, I think some of the zero trust architecture kind of stuff is really taking that into account. How do we naturally segment our applications and our services in a way that doesn't impact how we do business? So when we, like, our high value asset program was actually designed for that very specific purpose. Like, what are the most valuable data sets from the perspective of a threat adversary? And do we have the right security measures around that? As we look at our zero trust architectures, we can create that segmentation. So if one system is compromised, at the very least, it's not bleeding over to another system. And we are looking at even out of band communications and things like that on how would we respond to an attack if our email system is compromised, for instance. But it does take looking at systems from the perspective of, we think of, like, yeah, email is important, but it's just email. Well, try shutting it down and see what happens. So,
Right, right.
like, you got to run through those kinds of scenarios and actually see how it impacts your missions.
You recently received the Cybersecurity Leader of the Year award. I want to take an opportunity for you to share and expand a lot more in regards to the raising awareness around security threats that you were able to put into the program within DOJ. Phishing obviously was a key element of that, but it was all in that transition over the past year plus now in regards to teleworking, and that's a major area of change that took place within DOJ. But talk a little bit more about what kind of you did behind the scenes to make this such an effective program.
One of the first things we did launch a new method to do spear phishing training, and that was a big one. And we did outreach to our components on a monthly basis and sometimes more frequently. But we partnered with the vendor that we were using for that, and we started actually tailoring the types of campaigns. And the way we do that, we actually took data from what we were seeing, instead of just using the commodity ones where, a lot of organizations will look at and, here's the UPS one, or we're going to deliver a package for you type of campaigns that are very commodity and everybody's doing them in every company. And we started looking at what are the spear phishing attacks that are actually happening to us. So what are our users seeing every day? And we modeled our assessments after those attacks. We also looked at things like what's going on in our organization. Our users got really good at spotting the spear phishing tests, right? So we thought we got to up our game. We got to train our users not to spot the training, but to spot real stuff. And so we started trying to think about how will attackers actually make this look, and that's why we actually started integrating what our Justice Security Operations Center was seeing every day, and that was the input for how we did our assessments. And then talking to our users about it, like, hey, this is what happened, this is how it happened. Having those kinds of communications, building videos, and really just having a lot more candid conversations with our staffs on what this stuff's going to look like in the real life.
So helping them become truly a human firewall for you, because
You have to, but
yeah.
I mean, look at whether it be the SolarWinds attack or any of these major breaches. Like, it's not rocket science. It's bad passwords, it's social engineering people, and once in a while it's a supply chain attack. But even those could have rooted from that. I don't even know if we truly understand how SolarWinds was breached, but it often comes down to how people are being targeted.
And I imagine in an organization like Department of Justice, you sort of want to think that everybody has security top of mind, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean they have cybersecurity skills, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're 165,000 people, and they have lots of different kinds of jobs. And I would say most of them probably don't know what a spearfish is,
Right.
or if they get a strange phone call. Hopefully, the world is getting smarter on that stuff, but they work or people wouldn't do them.
Right. There's always that percentage, right?
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
So true. Well, Nick, listen, it's been great having you on, breaking down the executive order, and more importantly, talking about different approaches you're considering for that. The human element does always come into a kind of key concern, and probably will for many, many moons, right?
Yeah.
We just kind of have to do the best we can to make organizations more resilient, as we were discussing. So it's been a pleasure having you on today, and looking forward to having you in the future again.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Thanks, Stan. I really enjoyed the talk with you guys today.
Likewise. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Vic.
Thanks for listening to the Reimagining Cyber podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to have us cover a specific topic of interest, feel free to reach out to us, and you can find out how in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe. This podcast was brought to you by CyberRes, a micro-focused line of business, where our mission is to deliver cyber resilience by engaging people, process, and technology to protect, detect, and evolve.